I'm feeling a little tired. I get up at 4 o'clock in the morning. So I'll probably. Are you going to show the
Good afternoon, everybody. Glad to see you here. This is a special session that we added fairly recently to the program for you this week, but I'm really glad that we're able to have you be here today. A number of years ago, Senator Thune appointed me to the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence. It was 2019. We had a few meetings, and suddenly COVID hit, and we ended up working remotely. But it was an amazing experience, and Dr. P.J. Makish was involved in that project, and there's a big group of people in Washington, D.C. and spread around the country that were involved. We finished our work in 2021. We produced a book that I thought about bringing it over, but it's actually quite heavy and it's quite big. But I think we produced over 7,000 pages of reports. Hundreds, if not thousands, of interactions with people around the country on issues associated with artificial intelligence and national security. And the interesting and many, many recommendations for executive orders and congressional bills. And many of those recommendations were adopted and many others weren't, so it's sort of interesting. But at the end of this process, the leaders of that activity decided we weren't finished. We hadn't finished. There was more to do. There were more technologies than just our array of technologies. military affairs on the staff of the National Security Council, and a professor in the strategic department at the Naval War College, which is in the backyard of my other home in Rhode Island. We have a little connection there. And he's an award-winning author. He's written some books, has a very, very interesting background. So I hope in addition to the presentations they're going to give today and the discussion that they're going to start with you, that you have a chance to just chat and find out a little bit more about these two gentlemen and the work that they've done over their careers. Pretty remarkable. So, PJ, I believe you're going to start. I'm going to turn it over to you. So let's welcome him.
Marie, thank you so much. Good afternoon. Faculty and guests and students, thank you so much for making time to carve out of your week to be with us. The purpose of today is really to connect with you about what our project has been about and to invite you into that process and to give you information about that. But before we begin, we just wanted to get to know you a little bit. We heard that there were some people who had defended their PhDs today. Is that the case? Are there anybody who's in the group that's defended today? Just want to congratulate you if in fact you had. Okay. So they should be out celebrating.
They all passed out.
That's, I mean, technically where we all were when we defended, right? So that's very, and just also want to welcome any international guests. Are there any international students who are here with us today? Just always want to welcome you to the process. Very good. Thank you so much. Thanks for being here and welcome. So we come from a non-for-profit charity in Washington, D.C. Steve just landed today to be here with us. That really harkens back to the 1950s. Rockefeller approached Henry Kissinger, who was at Harvard at the time, and said that the United States is really not organized for its future. And the future they were beginning to see there was an assertive Soviet Union and how the Soviet Union was behaving after World War II. Of course, the containment strategy to deal with it was emerging through the democratic process. But at the same time, there was private leaders who said, we're not organized for this. So you need to convene thinkers from around the country to think how we might organize. It was called the Special Studies Project. It ran from 1956 to 1959, which means they were thinking a little bit ahead of the triggers, which was pre-Sputnik, if you're familiar with the moment. But when Sputnik, like the recent balloon from China, was flowing over the continent, the American people woke up to the fact that this state-on-state game could affect their lives and could intersect with the lives of everyday citizens. So pre that, 1956, they were convening panels. And so after Josie Marie was on the AI Commission, it was chaired by former CEO of Google, Eric Schmidt. And he was receiving warmth from both branches of government to say, this work should continue. It shouldn't just fall off a cliff. And you should expand it beyond AI. The remit should be larger to the technologies that could drive the destiny of nations, right? So why don't we do that? So Kissinger was also writing a book with Eric and said, you should follow it in the spirit of the SSP. That's why we're called the Special Competitive Studies Project. So we're reloading that history for the current competition we find ourselves in. So I will just share for less than 10 minutes. Steve will do the same. Our really intent is to dialogue with you, to answer any questions you may have in our time together, so we have maximum time to chat with you. So that's the history of the SCSP. In our original work called The Mid-Decade Challenges to American Competitiveness, we suppose that there are three futures that are passing through everyone's hands that live in this generation. The future, first of all, of geopolitics. And so if you saw in the news this week about how Xi Jinping is continuing his unlimited partnership with Vladimir Putin in the midst of a time when Vladimir Putin has invaded a nation unprovoked and conducted land war in Europe. That partnership and the partnership of Xi Jinping with other nations like Iran and brokering peace deals with nations like Saudi Arabia and Iran is the geostrategic world changing in our hands right now. Things are moving. And in fact, when Xi Jinping said goodbye to Vladimir Putin this week, he said, the global order hasn't been reset for 100 years. Let's do that. Good luck. It was overheard as they were parting goodbye. It wasn't on the microphone. The second future that is also passing through our hands in this generation which you're studying and going after your own professions is really the rise of authoritarianism in the world and the question of democracy and how democracy survives and how freedom of the people, for the people, by the people is a light that's not extinguished. And so we suppose that authoritarianism in the form of China, in the form of Russia, in the form of Iran, and other nations that have some authoritarian leanings today is not on the decline, but rather moving. And so there is a question about whether or not that world will win out or whether the democratic world will win out. That's probably transacting right now as we're alive. The third one is the nature of strategic technologies like the ones you're studying. So anyone that's devoted themselves to the digital domain and the digital sphere, you're looking at a general purpose technology which subtends most functions of society. And as artificial intelligence takes off, we're seeing a group of technologies that have the power potentially to shape the direction of nations. So the future of geostrategic politics, the future of autocracy and democracy, and the rise of strategic technologies, those three futures will create one future, the one that really occurs. We don't know what that one will be, but we do think we should be more organized for it. And that's the argument from the SCSP. So to close, just to give this thought, one thing that we've wondered about is, what if the future doesn't go the way we would hope? What would it look like? And so in the same mid-decade challenge report, we supposed, is it possible that the two largest economies in the world, so right now, China and the United States, is it possible that China could become the most dominant economy based on technologies it's starting to dominate, namely 5G and advanced networks, drone technology, and energy storage, batteries, the future of energy storage post-lithium? What if China did lead? Does it matter? What would that world look like if China was the leading economy? We further wondered, what if that sphere of influence became real and real countries with real people had to make decisions about which way they leaned, towards the United States or towards China? For all of the different reasons that we've reported, from supply chain dominance all the way to global strategic infrastructure like something called the Belt and Road Initiative, which actually terminates in the port of Haifa, Israel. The sphere of influence is also growing in China. What if that continued to grow? What if the authoritarian argument didn't look so bad? Or what if someone from the Chinese Communist Party who recently shared with me personally, what if there was no distinction between authoritarianism and democracy? What if China made that argument that we're as democratic as America is, and that America has authoritarianism too? What if people believed that? What would that world look like? What would it look like if the World Wide Web was no longer worldwide, but a splinter net with an internet called the Great Firewall, where communications are not allowed into China without being censored, meant that Chinese children that grow up only can communicate internally with Chinese children, but not the people of the world? What would that look like if the cyber domain was no longer the World Wide Web, but it became a splinter net? What would it look like if infrastructure could be attacked with ease by cyber means? So drinking water, if anyone's familiar with the Florida event last year of the rise of lye in the drinking water. What if the meat packing plants, if anyone's familiar with that event as well, that took place? What if just power in your nation's capitals was no longer secure, but could be attacked by cyber means? There is a world coming that may be here now about autonomous cyber attack and defend. And what would it look like if you could tell Alexa to turn off the lights in Washington, D.C. for 2 hours? Finally, what would it look like if the US military lost a battle? Is it possible? I suppose it is. And there are certain scenarios, if we believed that there was a just cause for, say, defending the people of Taiwan that China lays claim to through one China policy. What would it look like if America lost a battle there to defend the people in Taiwan? What would that look like? And then finally, what would it look like if the United States could not secure critical supply chains like microelectronics or basics like lithium for energy storage in the US, but then in a time of conflict, those things could be severed and we have no domestic picture? We suppose those 7 things I just laid out for you are possible. And that's a world. And so what the Special Competitive Studies Project has done is organized to shape what we hope would be a better world. And the way we do that is by convening panels from around the country and actually around the world through our foreign policy panel to think about that future and how we might organize for it. So that's the short story of what the project's about, why we think it matters. And as I transition to Dr. Rosen, why we came out here and why we travel is because we believe your own educational journeys, much like ours, will intersect with these worlds, whether directly or indirectly. And to the degree that that happens with purpose, is to the degree that we want to be helpful. So we're traveling to one university a month around the country to talk to students. We'll be leading an undergraduate workshop for 2 days here, Friday, Saturday. And our express purpose is to be helpful professionally to those who are in this arena that we see. So without further ado, Dr. Rosen, over to you, sir.
Thank you, PJ. Thank you all for coming on what looks like a beautiful afternoon early in the spring. Why am I here? I'm here because we all have the sense that we are in a competition with China, Russia, authoritarian countries in general. We call it a competition because we don't think we should call it a war. And we're worried about calling it a conflict. And we're not sure how to conduct ourselves in this competition, which includes many dimensions, including the technological dimension, which PJ emphasized. Why am I here? I don't have an answer to the question, how should we think about this competition? You're going to have to decide how to think about that. I'm an old guy. You're going to live in the world that is shaped by this competition, not me. So what am I going to do? I'm going to suggest to you some alternative ways of thinking about the competition, and then ask you, what do you think? What do you think is the right way to think about it? Because we all engage in competitions, but they have different characters, right? Suppose I'm competing in gymnastics. What do I do in gymnastics? I decide what my routine is going to be, how hard it's going to be, and then I do it as best I can. What I do does not depend on what the other people in the competition do. I just pick what I think I can do well, and I try to execute as best as possible. That's very often the way we think about technological competitions. I want to be good in artificial intelligence. I want to be good in bioengineering. I'm going to be ahead of the Chinese, but I'm going to do that simply by being as good as I can be, by working as hard, spending as much money as I can. That's one kind of competition. But there are other kinds of competitions. How many of you around in this room play poker? Okay? When you play poker, do you play the cards or do you play the player? You play the player. Why? Because winning in the competition depends on what the adversary does, right? You want him to ante up a lot of money when you have better cards than he does. Those of you who have a background in economics, in game theory, the definition of strategy is behavior conditioned on your expectation of how the other player will react to what you do. Are we in a competition in which what the Chinese and others do shapes what we do? And what we do shapes what they do? It seems to me equally plausible, compared to the first model, which is you simply run as fast as you can, that we're in a competition in which we're interacting with our adversary, and our adversary is interacting with us. Which means we have to think, what is he trying to get me to do, and what do I want to get him to do? Which means you have to look for things like tells, right? You play poker, indications of what the player is going to do. I find it useful to try to understand what China may do in response to what we do by using a Chinese military philosopher, Sun Tzu. Sun Tzu says, if the wise statesman, the wise general, studies the shape of his adversary, the characteristic patterns of behavior, which he replicates over periods of time that are specified. Predictive intelligence tries to study the shape of other phenomena. We need to study, on this model, the shape of Chinese behavior so that when we do things, the Chinese react in ways that are favorable to us, or at least we don't do things that produce Chinese behavior that we don't want to see. And we understand how they're trying to shape us. So on this understanding, the competition is about understanding the adversary and choosing what we do on the basis of what we think the adversary will do in response to what we do. Okay? That requires a deep understanding of the adversary. Okay? There's a third way of thinking about the competition, which is analogically. We'll use analogs. And people often do this because it comes naturally. Oh, this is another Cold War, right? And maybe it is, and maybe it isn't. But let me suggest to you 2 reasons why this competition is different from the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. PJ alluded to one. The Chinese are much more formidable competitors than the Soviet Union was. The Soviet Union had a GDP of perhaps 35% of the GDP of the United States. The Chinese either have or will have a GDP equal to that of the United States. The Soviet Union was good in narrow areas of technology, but didn't have the broad capabilities that the United States does. China seems to be developing a much broader S&T base, which allows it to compete with the United States across many domains. So China is economically more capable and formidable, and technologically more capable and formidable. Which means what? It means we have to pick our battles more carefully. We have to think carefully where we focus our available resources, because we can't beat the Chinese simply by being bigger and stronger than them, which is kind of how we beat the Soviet Union. Which leads us back to, again, how do we think about where to put our resources? Now, the Cold War this competition is different from the Cold War in a second way. The Chinese have studied us deeply, at length. They tell us so. How many of you have seen that video where Xi Jinping kind of makes himself emperor for life up on stage? It was at the recent Party Congress. You may remember from that video a short clip. The last premier of China, Hu Jintao, is an old man. People come to him and try to take away his folder, his papers, and he pulls back, and he's kind of hustled off the stage. And the guy sitting next to him gets up to help him, like a normal human impulse. And then the guy next to him grabs him by his coat and yanks him down. The guy who yanks him down is Wang Huning. He is the Chinese Communist Party's America expert. He sits at the high table. He lived in the United States for 4 years in the 80s and 90s. He published a book, America Against America, which you can read, based on his study of America. He has many things right, the internal conflicts and cleavages within the United States. He notices our consumer credit score system, which he said, hey, we in China can adapt that for our own purposes, and people will do it because they want to. And then he has a chapter on technology. It's a chapter about the space shuttle, but it's about technology. And he says, Americans are in love with technology. Americans think technology can solve everything. I mean, how did we deal with COVID? Not by having kind of rational social behavior, but by inventing a vaccine, right? And then in a throwaway line, he says, so if you want to break the spirit of the Americans, you have to beat them in technology. Okay? So the Cold War may be helpful in thinking about the current competition, but this competition is different from the Cold War because the Chinese are stronger economically and technologically than the Soviet was relative to the United States, and they have studied us very thoroughly, and they're using that understanding of us to help them get what they want. They invent narratives which they know resonate within us, within our country. Oh, you don't like what we did to the Uyghurs. No, we're no worse than what you did to the Native American populations. You say you're democratic, you're just as authoritative. They know that we have doubts. We question ourselves, and they play into that. So this competition is more challenging. So how do you think about the competition to wind up? Do you decide, I'm going to decide where I want to be strong, and I'm going to run as fast as I can? That's the usual way we do this. We put more money, put more resources, we'll do. Or are we going to study our adversary and focus our efforts in areas where if we advance, we lead our adversaries to react in ways which produce the world, the outcomes, the response that we wish to see? Two different ways of thinking about it. Both have their merits, okay? Finally, and to conclude, and then to open up the discussions to make it much more interesting than listening to another old professor talk, I share PJ's mission. Whichever way we think about the competition, I am convinced that the only way the United States will do well in the competition is by doing a better job of mobilizing and developing human talent. The Chinese have an extraordinarily well-functioning meritocratic selection and education system which is pushing hundreds of thousands of people into S&T. There are virtues and vices to the way they do it, but they are very strong. We need to mobilize all of the human talent that we can to help us prevail in this competition. That does not mean everybody has to go to work for the government or national security. There are lots of ways to build a strong America without being in the national security sector. But you should think about your career in science and technology with an eye on how it can be used and can work in tandem with people who are trying to create the futures that create the world in which my grandchildren, your children, will wish to live. So that's why I'm eager to learn from you and to hear your views and to open doors for you where we can in the future. We're here to introduce ourselves, we're here to suggest to you ways of thinking about the competition, and we're here to work with you to help you do what you want to do, utilizing the interactions and networks and activities that we're engaged with. That's what we have to offer. Ways of thinking about the competition and access to people, institutions, and programs which can help you develop your interests however you define them. So thank you for allowing me to address you. I look forward to the questions. Thank you.
We structured this so that we would have maximum time to talk with you. So we would love to start a dialogue at this time, genuinely. Any questions you may have, we would love to just reason with you about them. So here you are. You guys have all devoted yourselves to becoming masters of your domain at the graduate and postgraduate level. So please, any questions that you might have from what we've shared so far? Sir.
So you brought up Kissinger and how in the Nixon administration they basically were negotiating with Mao to open them up to the rest of the world and negotiate that. And also the reason for that is to place a wedge between Russia and China, which has eroded, and now they have a relationship again. It's a complex. You bet. So it's a complex. Of course, the international system is a complex thing, and it's changing to now a multipolar situation.
For sure.
And now we have a technology that has now challenged nation states, the nation state system that we've had since 1648, I think, 48, Westphalian system, right? So now we're in a situation where we don't know where it's going to go. So my question is, when it has to do with the American economy, What were leaders in the past thinking when our corporations were sending our factories over to China and not keeping it here? And did they think that was a strategic win? Because when we look at it now, we have to rebuild our ability to build a technology that we are designing. So I just want to know your perspective on that.
It's a fantastic question. Great power competitions happen in ways that intersect with something that's sometimes called spiral theory, where two nations' efforts to defend themselves simultaneously menace the other, and therefore both wind up in a conflict that neither side would have chosen. Those spirals have these histories, right? There's a fantastic history that I like to use, which is how did Spartans and Athenians go from fighting Persians to all of a sudden fighting each other 50 years later? It's called the 50 years in between, but it was in stages, right, in these steps. So you can see from at least just starting in World War II, with the workshop, we'll go further back. But just starting from World War II, we were fighting and dying next to each other, Americans and the PRC, right? And so this is pre the rise of communism. By just 1950, when China enters the war against the US in the Korean War, I've always liked to share with MFA officials from the PRC, you surprised us in 1950. It was a big surprise. And they will say, but you were very close to our country. I'll say, we were very close to your country, but you surprised us, right? And so things spiral, but the era that you described of sort of Kissinger's insight of, is it possible to friend China into the international order, to be the responsible stakeholder was the phrase. And is there a period of engagement where we can normalize relations, bring them into the United Nations, bring them into the P5, which we did, usher them into that process, help their prosperity, help this establishment of their central bank, and that eventually we're going to create a peaceful world this way. That era went away. And the story of how it went away is a good one. It's a bad one, but it's a good, important international relations story of how the bad part of the spiral is happening. But it happens in stages. So to answer your question, what I think is private sector players across the spectrum interact with state affairs on that continuum of competition. So in the 1950s, pre-Sputnik, how companies and industry was behaving is not the way it was behaving in 1985 when Sting was singing, "I hope the Russians love their children too." And so I would just submit that we're in an early stage of the intensity. It is getting, this year it is getting different. I was in the China shop in the White House just last year. And I would say this year is different from the year I was in the White House a year ago. I mean, it's changing. But I think corporate behavior is endogenous, but it responds to those exogenous changes in the spiral of the great power relations. Steve, what do you think about the corporation question?
Specifically on the private sector, it was the intent of the United States government to encourage the American private sector to become engaged in the Chinese economy and in the development of the Chinese science and technology base. This was first done during the Cold War because it was seen to be to the advantage of the United States to have a stronger China, which would draw resources of the Soviet Union away from NATO, away from the United States. There was an interesting decision point at the time of the demonstrations and massacres in Tiananmen Square, in which the H.W. Bush administration briefly ceased commercial interactions. But at the same time, privately, the George H.W. administration envoy said, look, rulers of China, we have to do this. People are angry with you, but don't worry. Within a year or two, we'll resume business as normal, which is what we did, which I think may have educated the Chinese leaders who say, well, Americans talk a good game about human rights and political rights, but at the end of the day, what they care about is making money. But then that changed somewhat, as PJ said, in the 1990s, the Clinton administration and the first part of the George W. Bush administration. We're going to help China become a member of the global economic community. We're going to give it most favored nation trading status. We're going to help it join the World Trade Organization. And people said this in private and public, because if we help China become a part of the global economy, we will accelerate the development of a Chinese middle class. And if China's middle class develops, eventually China will become democratic. And that did not happen. And we have a better understanding of it now, because we read Chinese Communist Party discourse. And it's clear, they said internally, and now it's published, the market serves the state. The market is like a bird in the cage. We let it sing, but we don't let it free. It's a vision of economics, which is we want a strong economy because that makes the state strong, but you don't let the private sector tell the state what to do. Okay. It was not crazy for Americans to think that if China developed a middle class, like many other countries, it would become democratic. But because of the nature of Leninist Central Party rule in China, which is determined not to give up power, economic development does not lead to liberalization, or at least certainly has not up until this point. So why was the private sector more and more heavily engaged in China? It was because people saw the opportunity to make money, and the United States government thought this was a good thing to do from the standpoint of the United States. And it turned out to be a bad bet. A colleague of mine at Princeton University, Aaron Friedberg, has written a book documenting all this called Getting China Wrong. How smart people, responsible people, tried to do what they thought was best, but they got it wrong. I hope that.
Sir.
I'm just trying to the mic.
Yeah, okay, oh, thanks. Remind me offline too, I want to talk about a skeleton key from Thucydides about this too. Please.
Okay, so my question is regarding how those of us, I know not everybody here is from South Dakota with the nature of our degree programs, but some of us are, and some of us feel the mission to stay here in South Dakota, but we also want to assist in the competition, and some of us are already working in sectors that have a voice in that, or I feel they do, but our voices often get muted as they go towards the coast to where those decisions are actually being made. How would you recommend that we keep those voices loud and proud while staying here, supporting the missions that are here in South Dakota that are also assisting with the competition?
I really appreciate this question. In some sense, it's why we exist, to create a plug-in for citizens in DC that's charitable. So we're not a think tank, we're not a government organization, but we're a 3-year project designed to convene our citizens to think together about how we might prepare for this era. So in some sense, we're reaching out across the country, coast to coast. This project is one of those things we're doing, but we also convene experts in panels. We take papers. If there are ideas, we call for requests for information. We have a podcast, we have a newsletter to stay engaged so that if you see there's something we're working on and you have thoughts about it, we're always open for business, for taking thoughts. One-on-one engagement is probably where I feel personally where we get a lot of our ideas, which we attribute, unless someone opts out. You know, we're an attribution organization to carry everyone's ideas forward. It's not about us. So in some sense, this our purpose is to be a plug-in for everyone, no matter where you are in the country. And we're 1 year underway now. We have a little less than 2 left. And so we hope to just continue to augment that, both digitally, in person, and through convenings. So that's I would say one way. I'd say another way is there are often conferences, let's say on the coast, right, in DC and other things. I know Stefan has one he was just mentioning to me in the fall. And these are great opportunities, I think, as well, to not necessarily get your ideas in the arena, but to meet people who can get your ideas in the arena. And so at those conferences, which we like to attend for specific purposes, as we write national action plans for advantage in certain technologies, these conferences are great places to plug in, just because you might meet people who will carry your ideas to action. So those are 2 ways. I think what you write, so if you're writing anything, or even if you're writing something that's not directly related to, say, your PhD or your postdoc, but you're writing something, a blog, anything, we read that. That's our intent, is to just read people's thoughts and adjudicate them and bring them to light when they're solid. So, and then I would say the last thing that kind of comes to mind is everything that you do to create advantage has this national benefit. So if you're advancing a technology or you're advancing cyber defense or information technology systems, you're taking a step change in cyber defense, anything to that end, if that's your everyday, you wake up, drink coffee, and go do that, you have a little piece of the innovation ecosystem in your hand. And that's what I say usually to every company that we engage with, is that we don't hold the innovation ecosystem in our hands in DC. It's in the hands of everyone out in the States, out in the world, among allies and partners. You have a little piece of the ecosystem in your hand. Sometimes I see a company, and I think you have a big piece of the ecosystem in your hand, because you can see it's something the world hasn't even seen yet, like one-shot learning instead of large data learning for AI systems. Saw a company doing it, blew my mind, a one-shot learning program that works like a human mind. Nobody knows this company's out there yet. I'm like, you have a big piece of the ecosystem in your hand. So I think that's a real way. It's not a superficial way. That advantage becomes thingly. And if you're producing goods and services, that's power. So those are the three ways, I think. I love this auditorium seating. It's not like anything I've seen before. It's really cool design. Sir.
I appreciated your comments about the interaction between Hu Jintao and Wang Huning, and your analogy to playing poker. You need to look for your opponent's tells, right? But that's an example of, I think, a very good example of how we're handicapped in seeing our opponent's tells. When it comes to understanding, or even in cyber technology, Jack Ma. I mean, what happened there? It's almost like we're playing poker blindfolded, whereas we all know what's going on between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, right? It's a different system, and if the poker analogy is going to work, I wonder how we're going to be able to play it effectively. And I was just curious to hear your comments on that.
Chinese, maybe, right?
It's a skill which has to be developed. 30 years ago, the number of people studying Chinese strategic behavior was small. It was confined to a small group of people. And to be honest, they had a particular worldview. And one of the things I did, people at PJ, is we helped get money to develop programs to broaden the base of our understanding of Chinese behavior. The more people studying China in the United States, the better. The more people who develop a deep, longitudinal understanding of Chinese behavior, the harder it is to keep yourself blindfolded. If you see patterns of behavior repeated over years, over decades, eventually it sinks in. So you had to create the institutional and human infrastructure, and we are better now than we were. If you now ask people how you understand China, you get a different answer from what you would have gotten 10 or 15 years ago. Part of that is headlines, part of that is Chinese behavior, part of that is the depth of our learning. The second issue, though, is what do you do with your knowledge of China? Okay, and again, that's where PJ is working. I'm actively working. You need to create new analytical and institutional centers of excellence. I teach courses in how to do the empirical work to understand the patterns of behavior of actors that are relevant to our national security. It's not alchemy, it's not magic. There is something that it's data driven. It's often the kind of data that we don't often collect on because it's hard to quantify, but it is data. But the answer to your question is, like creating expertise on China, you have to create analytical tools, teach them to people, and put them in places where they have access to the information that they need to understand the adversary. And by the way, you have to understand your own hand. You have to understand, and sometimes than it is to understand yourself, because we all want to believe things about ourselves, which may or may not be true. I just want to return very briefly to the question about how people in the heartland here can become more involved, because you're right, during the Cold War, foreign policy was the property of the East Coast establishment, which wound up not being a healthy thing. PJ said, writing is a powerful way of getting your ideas out. And here again, I'm putting my money where my mouth is. I'm working with young people to help them develop the writing skills. It's like anything else. The first time you sit down to write something which analyzes the ways in which cybersecurity ought to be analyzed given the nature of the Chinese adversary, you won't get it right. So I work with young people. Send me your outlines before you even write anything. What do you want to write about? Give me a rough idea, and then we kick it back and forth. Because as you know, when you have a good idea, it sounds great, but you try to put it on paper, it doesn't quite make sense. You have to boil it down into something that's focused. And then they write the drafts, and I work with them on their drafts. In other words, I do what you're supposed to do as a teacher. You help people develop their own power. But it's a skill, and as you've exercised a skill over years, you get better at it. You transmit that knowledge to other people. So this is an offer. If you want to write something, we'll make available to you our email addresses, and I'm happy to engage with you so that you can wind up getting more powerful versions of your ideas down on paper so that they're more likely to get published and more likely to have impact.
While the microphone's moving, one thing I wanted to mention that Steve wouldn't say about himself is that when the competition got intense with the Soviet Union, there was a need to understand the rival. In some sense, practicing Einstein's insight. If I had to save the world, I had 1 hour, I would study the problem for 55 minutes and solve for 5. Steve came from an organization's relationship with Andy Marshall, whose ambition to understand the weaknesses and the asymmetries of the Soviet Union came from reading their work. It was so the language skill was number one. And the times that I went in, I would just remember Andy Marshall pulling translated papers down from a stack to his desk to read the next one, just reading the rival. And when Steve went to the NSC in those days in 1993, he did a work that in some sense is credited in my circles as talking about the rise of China in 1993. And that came from just understanding what their military capabilities were and doing a net assessment. And so that is a tradecraft, the net assessment tradecraft. It starts with the Sun Tzu's insight about understanding the rival. There is actually a group, Steve teaches that. He also practices it with an organization in DC, and there are some others that are still teaching it, but it's all about how to do this better. Yeah.
I just had a thought about the private companies establishing their bases in different parts of the world, right? I think from a humanities standpoint, it's probably, it was a net positive. If I can talk from the perspective of India, I was in India for I was born in India, I was there for 20 years, I've been here for 20 years. I think a huge group of people became pretty wealthy because of American companies establishing bases in Bangalore and many other places, right? So it was pretty net positive thing. There's a huge growth of middle class, and a lot of people. I think U.S. had middle class is very wealthy in the past, and now India, China, and other countries have wealthy middle class. It's just unfortunate that philosophy hasn't changed, and we just have to be optimistic that people believe in democracy and because at least in the last 2,000 years of history, that's the only system that has probably worked well, and that's probably been fairer than other systems, right? So even though other people may believe other things, yeah, I just wanted to mention that it was a net positive thing, at least from India's standpoint. And you talked about 3 things in the beginning. I was also thinking whether there is an issue with rich-poor divide in the world right now, because rich people seem to be able to do much more. Because recently I was reading something on LinkedIn in which Reid Hoffman, who is the founder of LinkedIn, he wrote a book, 230-page book, using ChatGPT within a week. Right. So now using the new technologies, people who are in the 0.1% can do 1000x things much more than people on the other end of the spectrum. So they may just end up becoming way more richer, right? So is there a way to address those kind of things?
If I could respond briefly and anecdotally, I first visited India in 1990, and I've been going back as often as I can since then. And every time I go to India, in many ways, you have your own history, tradition, and culture, which is different. But in many ways, I feel at home in India because I get to group together with a group of Indians in universities, in business circles, And everybody's arguing. Everybody's yelling at everybody. It's a free and open discourse, and it feels comfortable. I've been going to China since 1999, although not so much recently, and there you don't have that, right? You go into a room, the seating in the room is hierarchical by position. The most important person is the front to the left, and way in the back are the young people. And the person in the front of the room says something, and everybody goes like that. So there is something, I think, not about Chinese culture necessarily, but about Communist Party centralized rule, which inhibits the kind of free discourse that you and I value as being one of the most important supports of democracy and byproducts of democracy. It's more powerful intellectually, economically. It's more powerful to have this free exchange of ideas. So to stop telling stories, I am trying now to build bridges between Indian technology centers and American technology, because you have centers of excellence in India, very often in the cyber industry. And you can be valued partners with people concerned with the same kinds of issues about cybersecurity that are broader than just India. And because there'll be these broader international coalitions or partnerships, they'll be more effective in developing the capabilities that we want to have, so that we're not dominated in the cyber world by people who have a very different system of values. So democracy, I am not pessimistic. I think democracy is messy, it's full of wild impulses, but at the end of the day, it's more powerful because of the way it develops and encourages the development of talent instead of controlling and directing it from the top. So everything I can do to enhance the natural superiority of democracy by encouraging partners, intellectual transfers of information, I think we're doing ourselves a favor. We're also helping the people who are doing the work, right? We're helping them build their careers, we're helping them build their lives. So I share with you your insight from the humanities, right? The insight from the understanding of how human beings behave. Thanks.
I appreciate the phrase net positive, because when you take the externalities out and you just look at it, you say, in the grand scheme of things, when a company goes global and is in other countries, if it's from a democracy, it's a net positive. And I think the question is that also true of China? So if we were to reverse the picture and you had, again, not the people of China, but the Chinese Communist Party that has the relationships with corporate executives like Jack Ma. There's a great piece called Jack in the Box about what happened to him. So they have control over quasi-state-owned enterprises. Would it look the same? And we're seeing pictures of it now to start to answer that question about what sort of Chinese corporate debt traps are looking like in Africa, in certain places. So I think it's a reasonable question to ask. It's a net positive, perhaps, when there's some bit of ethical code associated with the corporation or where they come from, about how people are treated. But is it true if an authoritarian quasi-state-owned enterprise comes to your country? Is that true? And that's why I think this competition really bears out in companies. Companies take on the characteristics of their states in some ways.
Well, I like the net positive idea as well, and the idea of competition itself is a developer, as a grower. We use it as a tool to educate our kids, to make them interested in doing certain things. To our adults, to our companies, to our businesses, to our cities, we compete with each other, and it makes us better. Our nations compete with each other, and they make us better. So while the competition exists, it might be challenging and we have our challenges, but overall there's great positives that come from the competition and putting us, giving us drive to create something that's better than ourselves. So just want to keep that in mind.
I can't agree with you more. I mean, in some sense, this is a philosophical insight that competition is in the nature of things and can be pro-social, pro-tech, pro-world. It can make things a better place. You laid out very nicely about how it's in different aspects of our society, and even the way sports play out in our children's lives and may make them stronger, not weaker, right? And so it's a great point. And in fact, after the fall of the Cold War in 1989, a lot of the adaptations that democracy made, like one called Project Socrates to do strategic technology for President Reagan, went away because the competition went away. And so the democracy retracted it to its moorings of just checks and balances to run the affairs of the country. But these competition organizations went away. Of course, Apollo, to go back to the private sector question and the role of Dakota, 81% of everything that was achieved by Apollo, according to the official history, between 1979 and 1969, was on contract with private sector companies, 81%. So would that have happened? Would we have hit the moon only 66 years after we learned how to fly? Would we have done that without competition? Probably not. Probably not. And so right now, I could agree with what you're saying, even at a national level. The job I went to go do in the White House was in some sense to create national plans to compete in X tech or Y tech. And we're doing the same thing at the Special Competitive Studies Project now. We're generating these national action plans that are detailed and gritty for how would you move to a position advantage across a decade with moonshots. LOE1 and all these plans are audacious technology objectives. Would we be doing that? I'm not sure I'd be an SCSP if there wasn't a competition. I don't know if I'd be doing this work. So it's an interesting insight. Yeah.
I'll just add a footnote. When we think of competition being positive, we generally think of competition that takes place within a framework of agreed upon rules, right? Business competition that involves murdering your competitors is not what we're thinking about, right? Capitalism exists within a framework of a legal system. Sports takes place within a network of rules. And you may make a mistake if you're in a competition with an adversary which doesn't agree to the same set of rules that you obey. And I think that was part of the problem that we had. There are, and were in our Chinese publications, Doctoral Rising, talking about unconditional, unconstrained warfare, right? This is, I live, you die. That's it. No rules, just winners. I think one of the things we want to move towards is not eliminating everybody who competes with us, but establishing a framework of agreed upon rules that constrain the competition, that make it acceptable, keep it within. And the Chinese recently, the last 2 weeks ago, said, we reject this idea. He said, no system of guardrails and rules, the Chinese foreign minister said, will protect the United States if it continues. So you're saying this is all or nothing. It's either we win or you lose. I think we want to move away from that. Say, look, we have disagreements. We have things where we're going to oppose each other, but it's within a system of rules that are enforced. That means something, but we're not there yet.
I think we have time for one more question.
I guess if I could, you mentioned the Sputnik, like U.S. collaboration with the Soviet Union at the time, Apollo-Soyuz test project, Mir, the space station. When they incursioned into Ukraine in 2014, we cut a lot of ties with Russia. But there was one thing up in orbit that kind of kept two countries together. I know right now the U.S. and China can't collaborate in space due to a variety of reasons, and the House Science Committee, whatever, law. Do you think with current adversaries right now we could use future, like we'll go back to the moon or back to Mars or something with a current adversary, because obviously we can't go alone on some of these big things?
I think, first of all, it's an optimistic thought, and it's certainly a position of the project that maximum allied and partner cooperation to move the world into a place we wish it to go rather than just allow it to drift is very much the spirit of the project. It's very much the spirit of it, the way it was in the 50s, the Special Studies Project. It was trying to think about, the book they wrote was called Prospect for America, but they also wrote about the prospect for the world. So I think it is right to think about there are sometimes institutional things that hold nations together, even in the worst of times. I think it's a great example of that. I do think, like the question that came earlier, there's stages of a competition. And along that spectrum, there are three things that moderate the behavior of nations, if Thucydides was correct, which is fear, honor, and interest. And so for honor, you may do these international things together. But if all of a sudden the one nation you're cooperating with starts doing what they're doing in Ukraine, can you abide with that based on honor? And that's where those three things are always moderating how much cooperation can be achieved on the spectrum, I think. It's the relative mix of fear, honor, and interest that drive the destiny of nations there. But I think it's a hopeful thing to think about. For sure.
I agree. I'll just tell what I'm a historian mostly. During the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union cooperated on a global project to eliminate smallpox. It turned out the Soviet Union had mass production capabilities for manufacturing vaccines, and it produced vaccines and distributed. And we thought this is a great example of cooperation, right? But it operated simultaneously with a massive clandestine Soviet biological warfare program, which used smallpox as a weapon. Because once everybody was vaccinated and smallpox was eliminated, people didn't get vaccinated anymore. And so the Soviet Union had a vector which they knew was undefended. So what has to proceed, but on an empirical basis, is your competitor really playing by the same rules that you're playing by? Or are they using your adherence to the rules to get an advantage for themselves? So
it's a great way to end. I just want to say thank you so much on behalf of Steve and I. Thank you for being here. Our whole team that's here from SCSP, our founder, Eric Schmidt, our leader, Ili Bayraktari. Thank you so much, Josie Marie. Thank you so much for hosting us. We look forward to being with you, continue to work with you, and hopefully it's just the beginning. Thank you so much.